Now, since I'm out of work from UPS for about six weeks, because I hurt my shoulder, I'm just trying to do stuff to occupy my time. So I'm gonna spend my time for the 6 weeks doing videos. And yesterday I got out and did went to a comedy thing, and they had open mic night. So I did my first open mic night for comedy yesterday. Didn't go too bad. Um, I was like one of those places where you could be yourself, like you could be as dirty as you wanted, and that's what I particularly wanted. I wanted something where I could be dirty and be myself because I have a filthy mind. Um, but besides that, I overall went pretty well. Um, and then next month I'll be starring in my first movie. Who knows if it will be the only movie I'll ever do, but but that's the thing. But today we're going to get into the Civil War. Um, of course, we've all had major wars throughout our history. Civil War is one of them. Um, the American Civil War, which went on from 1861 to 1865, was also known by other names, was a civil war in the United States between the Union and the Confederacy, the Union being the North and the Confederacy being the South, um, which was formed in 1861 by states that had seceded from the Union. Um, the central conflict leading to war was a dispute over whether slavery should be permitted to expand into the Western territories. Um, Now, leading to more, which would have led to more slave states, or be prohibited from doing so, which many believed would place slavery on a course of ultimate extinction, which it did. Um, and you can see some of the photos here of the war. Um, the top one is the Battle of Gettysburg. Then down here to the left, the Battle of Franklin, and then to the right was the U.S. Horse Artillery Brigade. The officers under Captain John Tidball. Then you had the Battle of Antietam, a Harvest of Death, and then the ironclad USS Atlanta. Um, now, now President Abraham Lincoln was president when the Civil War happened. Now, decades of controversy over slavery came to a head when Abraham Lincoln, who opposed slavery's expansion, won the 1860 presidential election. Um, Now, seven slave states responded to Lincoln's victory by seceding from the United States, and they formed the Confederacy. The Confederacy seized U.S. forts and other federal assets within its border. Now, the war began on April 12th of 1861 when the Confederacy bombarded Fort Sumter, South Carolina. A wave of enthusiasm for war swept over the North and South as military recruitment soared for this. Now, four more southern states seceded after the war began, and it was led by its president, the one and only Jefferson Davis of the Confederacy. Um, Now, the Confederacy asserted control over a third of the U.S. population in 11 different states, but 4 years of intense combat, mostly in the South, it ensued. Now, during 1861 and 1862, the Western theater, the Union made permanent gains though in the Eastern theater, the conflict was inconclusive. Um, so the abolishment of slavery became a Union goal on January 1st of 1863. So when Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which declared all slaves in rebel states to be free, applying to more than 3.5 million of the 4 million enslaved people in the country. Um, Now, to the west, the Union first destroyed the Confederacy's river navy by the summer of 1862. Now, the successful so when it came to so then much of its western armies and seized New Orleans. Now, the successful 1863 Union siege of Vicksburg split the Confederacy in two at the Mississippi River, while Confederate General Robert E. Lee's incursion on the north failed at the Battle of Gettysburg. Um, but the Western successes led to General Ulysses S. Grant's command of all Union armies in 1864. Inflicted an ever tightening naval brigade of the Confederate ports. The Union marshaled resources and manpower to attack the Confederacy from all directions. Now, this led to the fall of Atlanta in 1864. The two Union William Tecumseh Sherman, followed by his march to the sea, which culminated in him taking Savannah. Now, at the time, um, when it came to certain people, let's see here. So when it came to the Union and to the Confederacy, the Union had, I think the Union had 698,000 at its peak, and the Confederacy had 360 at its peak. Um, of course, this war had over 864,000 people die. Yeah, and like I said, there was a lot of this. So the last significant battle that raged on around the 10-month siege of Petersburg, which was the gateway to the Confederate capital of Richmond. Now the Confederates abandoned Richmond, and on April 9th of 1865, um, Robert E. Lee surrendered to Grant following the Battle of Appomattox Courthouse, setting in motion the end of the war. Lincoln would lived to see this victory, but was shot by an assassin on April 14th, dying the very next day. Um, now, so by the end of the war, much of the South's infrastructure had been destroyed. The Confederacy collapsed. Slavery was abolished, and 4 million enslaved black people were freed. Now the war torn nation then entered the Reconstruction era in an attempt to rebuild the country, bring the former Confederate states back into the United States, and grant civil rights to all freed slaves. Now, this war is one of the most extensively studied and written about episodes in the history of the United States, but it remains the subject of cultural and historiographical debate. Now, of continuing interest is the myth of the lost cause of the Confederacy, which will be my video for next week. The war was among the first to use industrial warfare. Railroads, the electrical telegraph, steamships, the ironclad warship, and mass-produced weapons were widely used. Now, the war left an estimated 688,000 soldiers dead, along with an undetermined number of civilian casualties, making this war the deadliest military conflict in American history. The technology and brutality of the Civil War foreshadowed the oncoming wars like World War I and World War II. Now, the origins of the war were rooted in the desire of the Southern states to preserve the institution of slavery. Now, historians in the 21st century overwhelmingly agree um, on the centrality of slavery in the conflict, because nobody really knows. At least for the Southern states, they disagree on which aspects, much like ideological, economical, political, or social, were most important during this time. On the North's reasons for refusing to allow the Southern states to secede, the pseudo-historical lost cause ideology denies that slavery was the principal cause of the secession, but a view disproven by historical evidence, notably some of the seceding states' own secession documents. Now, after leaving the Union, Mississippi issued a declaration stating our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery and the greatest material interest of the world. Um, now, excuse me. Now, the principal political battle leading to Southern secession was over whether slavery would expand into the Western territories, destined to become states. Initially, Congress had admitted new states into the Union in pairs, one slave and one free, but this had kept a successional balance in the Senate, but not in the House of Representatives. Um, so, as free states, they outstripped slave. No, free states outstripped slave states in numbers of eligible voters. Now, thus at the mid 19th century, the free versus slave status of the new territories would become a critical issue. Now, both for the North, where anti-slavery sentiment had grown, and for the South, where the fear of slavery's abolition had grown. Now, another factor leading to succession and the formation of the Confederacy was the development of white Southern nationalism and the preceding debates in decades that would lead on. Um, Now, the primary reason for the North to reject secession was to preserve the Union, a cause based on American nationalism. Background factors in the run up to the Civil War were partisan politics, abolitionism, nullification versus secession, Southern and Northern nationalism, expansionism, economics, and modernization in the antebellum period. Um, as a panel of historians emphasized in 2011, while slavery and its various and multifaceted discontents were the primary cause of disunion, it was disunion itself that sparked the war. So, here's a picture of Abraham Lincoln, who was president at the time of the Civil War. Um, so Abraham Lincoln won the 1860 presidential election. Southern leaders feared that Lincoln would stop slavery's expansion and put it on a course toward extinction. His victory triggered declarations of secession by seven slave states of the Deep South, all of whose riverfront or coastal economies were based on cotton that was cultivated by slave labor. Lincoln was not inaugurated until March 4th of 1861, 4 months after his 1860 election, which afforded the South time to prepare for the war. Nationalists in the North and Unionists in the South refused to accept the declarations of secession, and no foreign government ever recognized the Confederacy, but the U.S. government under President James Buchanan at that time refused to relinquish the nation's forts, which the Confederacy claimed were located in their territory. Um, Now, according to Lincoln, the American people had demonstrated, beginning with their victory in the American Revolution and the Revolutionary War and subsequent establishment of a sovereign nation, but that they could successfully establish and administer a republic. But yet Lincoln believed a question remained unanswered: could the nation be maintained as a republic, whether its government was selected based on the people's vote, given given ongoing internal attempts to destroy and separate from such a system? Now Lincoln's election provoked South Carolina's legislator to call a state convention to consider secession. South Carolina had done more than any other state to advance the notion that the state had the right to nullify federal laws and even secede. Now, on December 20th of 1860, the convention unanimously voted to secede and adopt a secession declaration. It argued for states' rights for slave owners, but complained about states' rights in the North and in the form of resistance to the Federal Fugitive Slave Act, claiming that northern states were not fulfilling their obligations to assist in the return of fugitive slaves. Um, the cotton states of Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas followed suit, seceding in January and February of 1861. Um, now, um, now here, now the slave states here that now almost a lot of states did have slaves. Uh, so the blue ones are Union states that banned slavery. Those are Democratic states mainly. These blue things right here are mostly Democratic states, and these slave states down here are Republican states that had slaves. But they seceded before April 15th of 1861. Um, now Lincoln's election provoked South Carolina's legislator, like I was saying, and they followed basic suit on 1861 to try to secede from the Union thing. So among the ordinances of secession, those of Texas, Alabama, and Virginia mentioned the plight of the slaveholding states at the hands of Northern abolitionists. Now the rest made no mention of slavery, but there were brief announcements by the legislators of the dissolution of ties to the Union. Now, however, at least four South Carolina, Mississippi, Georgia, and Texas provided detailed reasons for the secession, and they all blamed the movement to abolish slavery and its influence over the North. Southern states believed that the Fugitive Slave Clause Act made slaveholding a constitutional right. Um, these states agreed to form a new federal government, the Confederate States of America, on February 4th of 1861, and they took control of federal forts and other properties within their boundaries with little resistance from outgoing President James Buchanan, whose term ended on March 4th, and Lincoln came in. Um, now, at the time, President James Buchanan said the Dred Scott decision was proof that the Southern states had no reason to secede, and that the Union was intended to be perpetual. Now, he added, however, that the power by force of arms to compel a state to remain in the Union was not among the enumerated powers granted to Congress. Now, a quarter of the U.S. Army, the Texas garrison, was surrendered in February to State Forces by General David Twiggs, who joined the Confederacy. Um, now, as Southern as Southerners resigned their Senate and House seats, Republicans could pass projects that had been blocked, and these included the Morrill Tariff, the land grant colleges, a Homestead Act, Transcontinental Railroad, the National Bank Act, authorization of the United States note by the Legal Tender Act of 1862, um, and the end of slavery in the District of Columbia and the ban on slavery in the territories. The Revenue Act of 1861 introduced income tax to help finance the war. Um, Now, in December of 1860, the Crittenden Compromise was proposed to reestablish the Missouri Compromise line by constitutionally banning slavery in territories to the north of it, while permitting it to the south. Um, Now, the compromise would have prevented secession, but Lincoln and the Republicans rejected it. Lincoln stated that any compromise that would extend slavery would bring down the Union, but a February peace treaty conference met in Washington, proposing a solution similar to the compromise, was rejected by Congress. The Republicans proposed the Corwin Amendment, an alternative not to interfere with slavery where it existed, but the South regarded it as insufficient. The remaining 8 slave states rejected pleas to join the Confederacy following a no vote in Virginia's first secessionist convention on April 4th. On March 4th, on March 4th, 1861, Lincoln was sworn in as president in his inaugural address. He argued that the Constitution was a more perfect union than the earlier articles on Confederation and Perpetual Union, and it was a binding contract, and that secession was legally voided. He did not intend to invade Southern states, nor to end slavery where it existed, but he said he would use force to maintain possession of federal property, including forts, arsenals, mints, and custom houses that had been seized. The mails, unless repelled, will continue to be furnished in all parts of the Union where conditions did not allow peaceful enforcement of federal law. U.S. marshals and judges would be withdrawn, but no mention was made of a bullion lost from mints. He stated that it would be a U.S. policy to collect the duties and impost, um, and that there would be no invasion, but no use of force against or among the people anywhere that would justify an armed revolution. His speech closed with a plea for restoration of the Bonds Union, famously calling on the mystic cords of memory binding the two regions. Now, the Davis government of the new Confederacy sent delegates to Washington to negotiate a peace treaty, but Lincoln would reject negotiations because he claimed that the Confederacy was not a legitimate government, but to make a treaty with it would recognize it as such. Now, Abraham Lincoln instead attempted to negotiate directly with the governors of seceded states, whose administrations he continued to recognize. Now, complicating Lincoln's attempts to defuse the crisis was Secretary of State William Seward. William Seward had been Lincoln's rival for the Republican nomination, but embittered by his defeat, Seward agreed to support Lincoln's candidacy only after he was guaranteed the executive office then considered the second most powerful. Now, in the early stages of Lincoln's presidency, Seward held little regard over him due to his perceived inexperience. Seward viewed himself as the de facto head of government, the prime minister behind the throne, but Seward attempted to engage in unauthorized and indirect negotiations that would fail. Um, Lincoln was determined to hold all remaining Union occupied forts in the seceded states, like Fort Pickens, Fort Jefferson, and Fort Taylor in Florida, um, and Fort Sumter in South Carolina. Um, Now, the American Civil War began just a month after Lincoln was elected office. Um, so the Civil War began on April 12th of 1861 when Confederate forces opened fire on the Union-held Fort Sumter. Now, Fort Sumter is located in the harbor of Charlestown, South Carolina. Um, its status had been contentious for months. Outgoing President Buchanan had dithered in enforcing its garrison, commanded by Major Robert Anderson. Now, Robert Anderson took matters into his own hands, and on April 26th of 1860, under the cover of darkness, sailed the garrison from the poorly placed Fort Moultrie to the stalwart island of Fort Sumter. Now, Robert Anderson's actions catapulted him into hero status in the North, but an attempt to resupply the fort on January 9th of 1861 failed and nearly started the war then, but an informal truce held on. On March 5th, the day after Lincoln was elected, Lincoln was informed that the fort was low on supplies. Um, Now here's a picture of the Battle of Fort Sumter right up here. Now, Fort Sumter proved a key challenge to Lincoln's administration. Back-channel dealing by Seward with the Confederates undermined Lincoln's decision-making. Seward wanted to pull out of it, but a firm hand by Lincoln, James Stuart, who was a launch Lincoln ally. Lincoln decided holding the forts, which would require reinforcing it, was the only workable option. On April 6th, Lincoln informed the governor of South Carolina that a ship with food, but no ammunition, would attempt to supply the fort. Um, Historian McPherson describes this as a win-win approach, as the first sign of the mastery that would mark Lincoln's presidency. The Union would win if it could resupply and hold the fort, and the South would be the aggressor if it opened fire on an unarmed ship supplying starving men. An April 9th Confederate cabinet meeting resulted in Davis ordering General P.G.T. Beauregard to take the fort before supplies reached it. Um, okay, so at 4:30 a.m. on April 12th of 1861, Confederate forces fired on the first of 4,000 shells at the fort, and it fell the next day. The loss of Fort Sumter lit a patriotic fire under the North. On April 15th, Lincoln called on the states to field 75,000 militiamen for 90 days. Impassioned Union states met the quotas quickly. On May 3rd of 1861, Lincoln called for an additional 42,000 volunteers for 3 years. Now, shortly after this, Virginia, Tennessee, Arkansas, and North Carolina seceded and joined the Confederacy. And to reward Virginia, the Confederate capital was moved to Richmond, Virginia. Um, so Maryland, Delaware, Missouri, West Virginia, and Kentucky were slave states whose people had divided loyalties to northern and southern businesses and family members. Some men enlisted in the Union Army and others in the Confederate Army. Now, West Virginia separated from Virginia and was admitted to the Union on June 20th of 1863, though half of its counties were secessionists. Um, Maryland's territory surrounded Washington, D.C., and could cut it from the north. It had anti-Lincoln officials who tolerated anti-army rioting in Baltimore and the burning of bridges, both aimed at hindering the passage of troops to the south. Now, Maryland's legislature voted overwhelmingly to stay in the Union, but they rejected hostiles with its southern neighbors, voting to close Maryland's rail lines to prevent their use for war. Now, Lincoln responded by establishing martial law and unilaterally suspending the habeas corpus in Maryland, along with sending in militia units. Um, Now Lincoln took control of Maryland and the district of here, hold on. I think I went too far. Yeah, okay, right there. Okay, yeah, so Lincoln took control of Maryland and the District of Columbia by seizing prominent figures, including arresting one third of the members of the Maryland General Assembly on the day it reconvened. Now all were held without trial, with Lincoln ignoring a ruling on June 1st, 1861, by Supreme Court Justice at that time Roger Taney, and not speaking for the court that only Congress could suspend the habeas corpus law, um, ex parte Merriman. Now, federal troops imprisoned a Baltimore newspaper editor, Frank Key Howard, after he criticized Lincoln in an editorial for ignoring Taney's ruling. Um, in Missouri, an elected convention on secession voted to remain in the Union. When pro-Confederate Governor Claiborne Fox Jackson called out the state militia, it was attacked by federal forces under General Nathaniel Lyon, who chased the governor and the rest of the state guard to the southwestern corner of Missouri. And you could find this more on the the Missouri secession. Now, early in the war, the Confederacy controlled southern Missouri through the Confederate government of Missouri, but was driven out after 1862. Um, in the resulting vacuum, the Convention on Secession reconvened and took power as the Unionist provisional government of Missouri. Now, Kentucky did not secede right away, but it declared itself neutral. Um, when Confederate forces entered in September of 1861, neutrality ended, and the state reaffirmed its Union status while maintaining slavery. Now, during an invasion by the Confederate forces in 1861, Confederate sympathizers and delegates from 68 Kentucky counties organized a secession Russell Convention, and it formed the shadow Confederate government in Kentucky. Um, its jurisdiction extended only as far as the Confederate battle lines in the Commonwealth, which at its greatest extent was over half the state, and it went into exile after October of 1862. Um, after Virginia's secession, a Unionist government in Wheeling asked 48 counties to vote on an ordinance to create a new state in October of 1861. A voter turnout of 34% approached the statehood bill, with 96% approving, and 24 secessionist counties were included in the new state. And the ensuing guerrilla war engaged about 40,000 federal troops for much of that war. Congress admitted West Virginia to the Union on June 20th, 1863. West Virginians had provided about 20,000 soldiers to each side in the war, and a Union secession attempt occurred in East Tennessee, but was suppressed by the Confederacy, and which arrested over 3,000 men suspected of loyalty to the Union, and they were all held without a trial. Now, during the time of the Civil War was marked by intense and frequent battles. Um, over 4 years, 237 named battles were fought, along with many smaller actions, often characterized by their bitter intensity and high casualties. Um, Historian John Keegan described it as one of the most ferocious wars that was ever fought in the United States, where in many cases the only target was the enemy soldiers. Now here's a picture of rioters attacking a building during the New York anti-draft riots of 1863. And you can see that right here. So as the Confederate States organized, the U.S. Army at the time numbered 16,000 when Northern governors began mobilizing their militias. Now the Confederate Congress authorized up to 100,000 troops in February. By May, Jefferson Davis was pushing for another 100,000 soldiers for 1 year of the duration, and the U.S. Congress responded in kind. Um, Now, in the first year of the war, both sides had more volunteers than they could effectively train and equip. Um, After the initial enthusiasm faded, relying on young men who came of age each year was not enough. But both sides enacted draft laws and conscription to encourage or forced volunteering, though relatively few were drafted. The Confederacy passed a draft law in April of 1862 for men aged 18 to 35, with exceptions for overseers, government officials, and clergymen. Now, the U.S. Congress followed in July, authorizing a militia draft within states that could not meet their quota with volunteers. European immigrants joined the Union Army in large numbers, including 177,000 born in Germany and 144,000 born in Ireland. About 50,000 Canadians served, and also around 2,500 of them, were black. Um, the Emancipation Proclamation went into effect in January of 1863. Ex-slaves were energetically recruited to meet state quotas. States and local communities offered higher cash bonuses for white volunteers, but Congress tightened the draft law in March of 1863, and men selected in the draft could provide substitutes until mid 1864 pay commutation like the commutation money. Now many eligibles pulled their money to cover the cost of anyone that was drafted. Um, Families used the substitute provision to select which men should go into the army and which should stay home. Um, now there was much evasion and resistance to the draft, especially in Catholic areas. The New York City draft riots in July of 1863 involved Irish immigrants who had been signed up as citizens to swell the moat of the city's democratic political machine, and not realizing that it made them liable for the draft. Now, of the 168,649 men that were procured from the Union through the draft, 117,986 people were substitutes, leaving only 50,663 who were conscripted. Um, in the North and South, draft laws were highly unpopular. In the North, some 120,000 men evaded conscription, many fleeing to Canada, and another 280,000 soldiers deserted during the war. Um, at least 100,000 Southerners deserted, but about 10% of the total. Southern desertion was high because many soldiers were more concerned about the fate of their local area than the Southern cause. Now, in the North, bounty jumpers enlisted to collect the generous bonus deserted and re-enlisted under a different name for a second bonus. 141 were caught and they were executed. Um, Now, from a tiny frontier force in 1860, the Union and Confederate armies grew into the largest and most efficient armies in the world within a few years' time. Some European observers at the time dismissed them as amateur and unprofessional, but historian John Keegan concluded that each outmatched the French, Prussian, and Russian armies, and without the Atlantic, they could have threatened any of them with defeat. Um, now, unionism was strong in certain areas within the Confederacy, but as many as 100,000 men living in states under Confederate control served in the Union Army or pro-Union guerrilla groups. Although they came from all classes, most Southern Unionists differed socially, culturally, and economically from their region's dominant power, pre-war slave-owning planter class. Um, now, Now, at the war start, a parole system operated under which captives agreed not to fight until they were exchanged. They were held in camps run by their army, um, and they were paid but not allowed to perform any military duties. The system of exchanges collapsed in 1863 when the Confederacy refused to exchange black prisoners. But after that, about 56,000 men of the 400 of the okay, so about 56,000 of the 409,000 prisoners of wars died in prisons, accounting for 10% of the conflict's fatalities. Um, Now, historian Elizabeth Leonard writes that between about 500 to 1,000 women enlisted as soldiers on both sides disguised as men. Women also served as spies, resistance activists, nurses, and hospital personnel, but women served on the Union hospital ship Red Rover, and they nursed Union and Confederate troops at field hospitals. Mary Edwards Walker, the only woman ever to receive the Medal of Honor, served in the Union Army and was given the medal for treating the wounded during the war. Um, One woman, Jenny Hodgers, fought for the Union under the name Albert D.J. Cashier, but after she returned to civilian life, she continued to live as a man until she died in 1915 at the age of 71. And here's a photo of the battle between the USS Monitor and Merrimack. So the so the so then so the Union Navy in 1861 was relatively small, but by 1865 it expanded rapidly to 6,000 officers, 45,000 sailors, and 671 vessels that totaled 510,000 and 369 tons. Now, its mission was to blockade Confederate ports, control the whole river system, defend against Confederate raiders on high seas, and be ready for any possible war with the British Royal Navy. Um, the main ravine war was fought in the west, where major rivers gave access to the Confederate heartland. The U.S. Navy eventually controlled the Red, the Tennessee, Cumberland, Mississippi, and Ohio rivers, and in the east, the Navy shelled Confederate forts and supported the coastal army operations. Now, the Civil War occurred during the early stages of the Industrial Revolution, leading to naval innovations, including the ironclad warship. The Confederacy, recognizing the need to counter the Union's naval superiority, built or converted over 130 vessels, including 26 ironclads. Um, Now, the Union Navy used timberclads, tinclads, and armored gunboats. Shipyards in Cairo, Illinois, and St. Louis built or modified steamboats. Now, the Confederacy experimented with the submarine CSS Hunley, which proved to be very unsuccessful, and with the ironclad CSS Virginia rebuilt from the sunken Union ship Merrimack. On March 8th of 1862, Virginia inflicted significant damage on the Union's wooden fleet, but the next day the first Union ironclad, the USS Monitor, arrived to challenge it in the Chesapeake Bay. The resulting 3-hour Battle of Hampton Roads was a draw, proving ironclads were effective warships. The Confederacy scuttled the Virginia to prevent its capture, while the Union built many copies of the Monitor. Now, the Confederacy's efforts to obtain warships from Great Britain failed, as Britain had no interest in selling warships to a nation at war with a stronger enemy and feared soaring relations with the U.S. Um, Now, by early 1861, General Winfield Scott had devised the Anaconda Plan, which that is highlighted. I'm not sure what that is. To win the war with the minimal bloodshed, calling for a blockade of the Confederacy to suffocate the South into surrendering. Um, Now, Lincoln adopted parts of the plan, but opted for a more active war strategy. In April of 1861, Lincoln announced a blockade of all southern ports. Commercial ships could not get insurance, ending regular traffic. The South blundered by embargoing the cotton exports before the blockade was fully effective, but by the time they reversed this decision, it was too late. Um, Now, the blockade shut down the 10 Confederate seaports with railroads that moved across all the cotton. By June of 1861, warships were stationed off the principal southern ports, and a year later, nearly 300 ships were in service. So the Now the Confederates began the war short on military supplies, which which the agrarian South could not produce. Northern arm manufacturers were restricted by an embargo, ending the existing and future contracts with the South. Now, the Confederacy turned to foreign sources, connecting with financiers and companies like S. Isaac, Campbell and Company, and the London Armory Company in Britain, becoming the Confederacy's main source of arms. Now, to transport arms safely to the Confederacy, British investors built small, fast, steam-driven blockade runners that traded arms and supplies from Britain through the Bermuda Triangle, Cuba, and the Bahamas in exchange for high-priced cotton. Now, many were lightweight and designed for speed, only carrying small amounts of cotton back to England. Um, when the Union Navy seized a blockade runner, the ship and cargo were condemned as a prize of war and sold, with proceeds going to the Navy sailors. The captured crewmen, mostly British, would eventually be released. Um, Now, the southern economy nearly collapsed during the war due to multiple factors. The most notable being severe food shortage, failing railroads, loss of control over key rivers, foraging by northern armies, and the seizure of animals and crops by the Confederate forces. Now, historians agree the blockade was a major factor in ruining the Confederate economy. Now, however, Wise argues blockade runners provided enough of a lifeline to allow Robert E. Lee and Confederate generals to continue fighting for additional months. As a result of supplies that included 400,000 rifles, lead, blankets, and boots that the Confederate economy could no longer supply. Um, Now, the Confederate cotton crop became nearly useless, which cut off the Confederacy's primary income source. Critical imports were scarce, and coastal trade was also largely ended. The blockade's success was not measured by the few ships which slipped through, and by the thousands that never tried. European merchant ships could not obtain insurance for their ships in transport and were too slow to evade the blockade, leading them to cease docking in Confederate ports. Now, now to fight an offensive war, the Confederacy purchased arms in Britain and they converted British-built ships into commerce raiders, which targeted the Union States merchant marine ships in the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans. Now, the Confederacy smuggled 600,000 arms, and they enabled it to continue fighting for 2 more years. As insurance rates soared, American flagships largely ceased traveling in international waters, though some were reflagged with European flags, which allowed them to continue operating. Now, after the conclusion of the Civil War, um, the U.S. government demanded Britain reimburse it for the damage caused by blockade runners and raiders that were outfitted in British ports. Now, Britain paid the $15 million in 1871, which covered costs associated with commerce raiding, but nothing more. Um, Now, although the Confederacy hoped Britain and France would join them against the Union, this was never likely to happen. So they sought to bring them in as mediators. Um, the Union worked to block this and threatened any war against any country that recognized the Confederacy. In 1861, Southerners voluntarily embargoed cotton ships, hoping to start an economic depression in Europe that would force Britain to enter the war, but this failed. Now, even worse, Europe turned to Egypt and India for cotton, which they found superior, hindering the South's post-war recovery. Cotton diplomacy proved to be a failure because Europe had a surplus on cotton. While the 1860 to 1862 crop failures in Europe made the North's grain exports critically important, it also helped turn European opinion against the Confederacy. Um, it also said that King corn was more powerful than King cotton as U.S. grain increased from a quarter to almost half of British imports. Now, meanwhile, the war created jobs for arms makers, iron workers, and ships to transport weapons. Now Lincoln's administration initially struggled to appeal to European public opinion at first, but at first, diplomats explained that the U.S. was not committed to ending slavery, and they emphasized legal arguments about the unconstitutionality of secession. Now, Confederate representatives, however, focused on their struggle for liberty, commitment to free trade, and the essential role of cotton in the European economy. Now, the European aristocracy was absolutely gleeful in pronouncing the American debacle as proof that the entire experiment um, in popular government had failed. Now, European government leaders welcomed the fragmentation of the ascendant American republic. Now, however, a European public with liberal sensibilities remained, um, but which the U.S. sought to appeal to by building connections with the international press. Now, by 1861, Union diplomats like Carl Schurz realized that emphasizing the war against slavery was the Union's most effective moral asset in swaying European public opinion. Now, Seward was concerned an overly radical case for reunification would distress European merchants with cotton interests. Even so, he supported a widespread campaign of public diplomacy. Now, the U.S. Minister to Britain, Charles Francis Adams, proved adept and convinced Britain not to challenge the Union and convinced Britain not to challenge the Union blockade. Now, the Confederacy purchased warships from commercial shipbuilders in Britain, with the most famous being the CSS Alabama, which caused considerable damage and led to serious post-war disputes. Now, however, public opinion against slavery in Britain created a political liability for politicians, where the anti-slavery movement was powerful. Now, war loomed in 1861, in late 1861, between the U.S. and Britain over the Trent Affair, which that's also highlighted. I'm not sure what the Trent Affair is. Um, which began the U.S. Navy personnel which began when U.S. Navy personnel boarded the British ship Trent and seized two Confederate diplomats. Um, Now, however, London and Washington smoothed this over after Lincoln released the two men. Now, Prince Albert left his deathbed to issue diplomatic instructions to Lord Lyons during the Trent Affair. Now, his request was honored, and as a result, the British response to the U.S. was toned down, helping to avert war. In 1861, the British government considered mediating between the Union and Confederacy, um, though such an offer would have risked war with the U.S. British Prime Minister. Lord Palmerston reportedly read Uncle Tom's Cabin 3 times when deciding what his decision would be. Um, now the Union victory at the Battle of Antietam caused the British to delay this decision. Um, so the Emancipation Proclamation increased the political liability of supporting the Confederacy, but realizing that Washington could not intervene in Mexico as long as the Confederacy controlled Texas. Now, France invaded Mexico in 1861 and installed the Habsburg Austrian Archduke Maximilian the First as emperor. Now, Washington repeatedly protested France's violation of the Monroe Doctrine, despite sympathy for the Confederacy. Now, France's seizure of Mexico ultimately deterred it from war with the Union. Um, um, Confederate offers late in the war to end slavery in return for diplomatic recognition were not seriously considered by London or Paris. Um, After 1863, the Polish revolt against Russia further distracted the European powers and ensured that they remained neutral. Um, Now, Russia supported the Union largely because it believed that the U.S. counterbalanced its geopolitical rival, the UK. In 1863, the Imperial Russian Navy's Baltic and Pacific fleets wintered in the American ports of New York and San Francisco, respectively. Um, Now, the Eastern Theater refers to the military operations east of the Appalachian Mountains, which included Virginia, West Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania, and the District of Columbia and the coastal fortifications and seaports of North Carolina. Um, Now, Major General George B. McClellan took command of the Union Army the Union Army of the Potomac on July 26 of 1861, and the war began in earnest in 1862. And the 1862 Union strategy called for simultaneous advances along four axes. McClellan would lead the main thrust of Virginia towards Richmond. Ohio forces would advance through Kentucky into Tennessee. The Missouri Department would drive south along the Mississippi River, and the westernmost attack would originate from Kansas. Um, Now, the primary Confederate force in the Eastern Theater was the Army of Northern Virginia. This army was originated as the Confederate Army of the Potomac, um, which was organized on June 20th of 1861 from all operational forces in Northern Virginia. On July 20th and July 21st, the Army of the Shenandoah and forces from the District of Harper's Ferry were added. Um, units from the Army of the Northwest were merged into the Army of the Potomac between March 14th and May 17th of 1862. Um, now the Army of the Potomac was renamed Army of Northern Virginia on March 14th, and the Army of the Peninsula was merged into it on April 12th of 1862. When Virginia declared its secession in April of 1861, Robert E. Lee chose to follow his home state despite his desire for the country to remain intact and an offer of a senior Union command. Um, in his four-volume biography that Lee published in 1934 and in 1935, historians Douglas Freeman wrote that the Army received its final name from Lee when he issued orders assuming command on June 1st of 1861, or 1862, sorry. However, Freeman wrote Lee corresponded with Brigadier General Joseph E. Johnston, his predecessor in Army command before that date, and referred to Johnston's command as the Army of Northern Virginia. Part of the confusion results from the fact that Johnston commanded the Department of Northern Virginia as of October 22nd of 1861, and the name Army of Northern Virginia was seen as an informal consequence of its parents' department's name. Jefferson Davis and Johnston did not adopt the name, but the organization of units as of March 14th were clearly the same organization that Lee received on June 1st and is generally referred to as the Army of Northern Virginia, even if that is correct only in retrospect. Michael who? Which Michael are you talking about? There's so many Michaels that I know. Um, So on July 4th at Harper's Ferry, Colonel Thomas Jackson assigned Jem Stewart the command of all cavalry companies of the Army of the Shenandoah. And Jackson eventually commanded the Army of Northern Virginia's cavalry. Um, now, um, now called the Philippi races because of its brevity, Philip Virginia, which is now Philippi, West Virginia, was the scene of the first organized land action of the American Civil War on June 3rd of 1861. In July of 1861, and the first in a series of prominent battles in the war, the Union Army troops commanded by Major General Irvin McDowell attacked the Confederate forces, which were under the command of Beauregard near the national capital in Washington. Now, the Confederacy successfully repelled the attack in the First Battle of Bull Run. Um, Now, in the beginning of the Civil War, the Union appeared to hold the upper hand, but the Union Army routed Confederate forces and holding defensive positions. But Confederate reinforcements under Joseph E. Johnston arrived in the Shenandoah Valley by railroad, and the battle's course quickly changed. A brigade of Virginians, commanded by Thomas J. Jackson, then a relatively unknown brigadier general from Virginia Military Institute, um, stood its ground, leading to Jackson earning the nickname Stonewall. Lincoln urged the Union Army to commence offensive operations against Confederate forces, which led General George B. McClellan in the spring of 1862 to attack Virginia by the way of the peninsula between the York River and James River southwest of Richmond. McClellan's army reached the gates of Richmond into the Peninsula Campaign. Now, also in the spring of 1862, in Shenandoah Valley, Jackson led his Valley campaign, during which he employed rapid and unpredictable movements on the interior lines. Jackson's 17,000 troops marched 646 miles in 48 days, during which they won minor battles as they successfully engaged the three Union armies, comprising of 52,000 men, including those of Nathaniel P. Banks and John C. Fremont, preventing them from reinforcing the Union offensive against Richmond. The swiftness of Jackson's troops earned them the nickname Foot Cavalry. Now Johnston halted McClellan's advance at the Battle of Seven Pines, but he was wounded in the battle, and Robert E. Lee assumed his position of command. Um, Now Lee and his senior subordinates, James Longstreet and Stonewall Jackson, defeated McClellan in the 7 Days Battle, forcing McClellan's retreat. Now, during the Northern Virginia campaign, which included the Second Battle of Bull Run, Confederate forces registered another important military victory. McClellan would resist General-in-Chief Halleck's orders to send reinforcements to John Pope's Union Army of Virginia, um, which enabled Lee's Confederate forces to defeat twice the number of combined enemy troops. Now, emboldened by the second Bull Run, Confederate forces launched their first invasion of the North in the Maryland campaign, during which Robert E. Lee had led 45,000 Army of Northern Virginia troops across the Potomac River um, into Maryland on September 5th. Now Abraham Lincoln then restored Pope's troops to McClellan, and McClellan and Lee clashed in the Battle of Antietam near Sharpsburg, Maryland, on September 17th of 1862, which proved to be the bloodiest single day in both the Civil War and U.S. military history. Um, Now Lee's army retreated to Virginia before McClellan could destroy it, leading the Battle of Antietam to be widely viewed as a Union victory, since it halted Lee's invasion of the North and provided an opportunity for Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, which he issued as an executive order on January 1st of 1863. Um, um, now McClellan failed to respond in any measurable way to Lee's attempt to invade the North at Antietam, and it led to his replacement by Major General Ambrose Burnside. Now Burnside led Union Army troops. Okay, yeah. So McClellan. McClellan failed to respond in any measurable way to Lee's attempts to invade the North at Antietam, and that led to his replacement by Major General Ambrose Burnside. Now Ambrose Burnside had led the Union Army troops in the Battle of Fredericksburg. Um, um, where they were defeated on December 13th of 1862. Now, over 12,000 Union soldiers were killed or wounded during futile attempts by Union troops to launch frontal assaults against Marye's Heights. After the battle, General Burnside was replaced by Major General Joseph Hooker. Now Joseph Hooker too proved unable to defeat Lee's army, despite having more than twice as many troops as Robert E. Lee. Now Joseph Hooker proved Chancellorsville's campaign ultimately proved ineffective, and he was soundly defeated in the Battle of Chancellorsville, which was fought between April 30th and May 6th of 1863. Chancellorsville is known as Lee's perfect battle because his risky decision to divide his army paid off. During the Battle of Chancellorsville, Stonewall Jackson was shot in his left arm and right hand by friendly fire, leading to the amputation of his arm, and he died of pneumonia. Yeah, because this goes on for a while because, like I said, the Civil War went on for 4 years. So there's a whole thing on Wikipedia and photos of it if you want to study more. Um, Now the fiercest fighting of the battle, and the second bloodiest day of the Civil War occurred on May 3rd, as Robert E. Lee launched multiple attacks against the Union position at Chancellorsville. That same day, John Sedgwick advanced across the Rappahannock River, and he defeated the small Confederate force at Marye's Heights in the Second Battle of Fredericksburg, and then moved to the west. Confederate forces succeeded in military delaying Union forces in the Battle of Salem Church. Um, there's also been movies made about the Civil War too, and some about any war in general. Now at the end, Joseph Hooker was replaced by Major General George Meade during Robert E. Lee's second invasion of the North in June. In the Battle of Gettysburg, which proved the war's bloodiest and one of its most strategically significant battles, Meade defeated Lee in a 3-day battle between July 1st and July 3rd of 1863. Now, the Battle of Gettysburg caused over 50,000 um, Union's favor. Pickett's charge launched on July 3rd. On the final day of the Battle of Gettysburg is considered the high water mark of the Confederacy, representing the collapse of any credible prospect that the Confederacy could prevail in the war. Now, at Gettysburg, Lee's Army of Northern Virginia suffered 28,000 casualties versus Meade's 23,000, and Lee was repelled in a failed attempt to invade and occupy Union territory. Um, Now, the Western Theater refers to military operations between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River, including Alabama, Georgia, Florida, Mississippi, North Carolina, Kentucky, South Carolina, Tennessee, and parts of Louisiana. Um, Now, the primary Union forces in this theater were the Army of the Tennessee and the Army of the Cumberland, named for two rivers, Tennessee River and Cumberland River. After Meade's inconclusive failed campaign, Lincoln turned to the Western Theater for new leadership. Now, at the same time, the Confederate stronghold of Vicksburg surrendered, giving the Union control of the Mississippi River, um, permanently isolating the Western Confederacy and producing the new leader Lincoln needed, Ulysses S. Grant, who would eventually become president. Now, the Army of Tennessee, which served as the primary Confederate force in the Western Theater, was formed on November 20th of 1862 when General Braxton Bragg renamed the former Army of Mississippi. While Confederate forces had success in the Eastern Theater, they were defeated many times in the West. Um, Now, the Union's key strategist and tactician in the West was Ulysses S. Grant, who led the Union to victories and battles at Fort Henry on February 6th of 1862 and Fort Donelson between February 11th and February 16th of 1862, earning him the nickname of the Unconditional Surrender Grant. With these victories, the Union gained control of the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers. Nathan Bedford Forrest rallied nearly 4,000 Confederate troops and led them to escape across the Cumberland River. Nashville and Central Tennessee fell to the Union, leading to attrition of local food supplies and livestock and a breakdown in social organization. Um, Now, Confederate General Leonidas Polk subsequently invaded Columbus, Kentucky, which ended Kentucky's policy of neutrality, and they turned against the Confederacy. Grant used river transport and Andrew Hull Foote's gunboats of the Western Flotilla, threatening the Confederacy's Gibraltar of the West and Columbus. Um, in Columbus, Kentucky. Although rebuffed at Belmont, Grant cut off Columbus. Confederate forces, lacking their gunboats, were forced to retreat, and the Union took control of the West Kentucky, and they opened Tennessee in March of 1862. At the Battle of Shiloh in Shiloh, Tennessee, in April of 1860, in April of 1862, Confederate forces launched surprise attacks on the Union forces, pushing them back to river as night fell. Over that night, however, the Navy landed the reinforcements and Grant counterattacked. Grant and the Union ultimately won a decisive victory in the first battle with a high number of casualties in what proved to be the first in a series of such battles. Um, Confederate forces lost Albert Sidney Johnston, who considered their finest general, before Lee emerged to assume command. One of the early Union objectives was to capture the Mississippi River, which would permit it to cut the Confederacy in half. The Mississippi was open to Union traffic to the southern border of Tennessee after it took Island Number 10, New Widgeon, Missouri, and then Memphis, Tennessee. Um, Now, in April of 1862, the Union Navy captured New Orleans. The key to the river was New Orleans, the South's largest port and greatest industrial center. Um, the U.S. naval forces under Farragut ran past Confederate defenses south of New Orleans. Confederate forces abandoned the city, giving the Union a critical anchor in the Deep South, which allowed Union forces to move up to the Mississippi, and Memphis fell to the Union forces on June 6 of 1862, allowing it to serve as a key base for further Union advances south along the Mississippi. Now, on the Mississippi River, the Union took every fortress city with the exception of Vicksburg, Mississippi. But Confederate control of Vicksburg was sufficient in preventing the Union from controlling the entire river. Now, Bragg's second invasion of Kentucky and the Confederate Heartland Offensive included initial success, including Kirby Smith's triumph in the Battle of Richmond and the capture of the Kentucky capital of Frankfort, Kentucky on September 3rd of 1862. Um, Now, the campaign ended with a meaningless victory over Major General Don Carlos Buell at the Battle of Perryville, and Bragg was forced to end his attempt to invade and control Kentucky, lacking logistical support and infantry recruits. Bragg was instead forced to retreat and ended up being narrowly defeated by Major General Rosecrans, William Rosecrans in the Battle of Stones River in Tennessee, in what proved to be the culmination of the Stones River campaign. Now, U.S. naval forces assisted Grant in the long, complex Vicksburg campaign, which resulted in Confederate forces surrounding the Battle of Vicksburg in July of 1863, which cemented the Union control of the Mississippi River and one of the war's turning points. The one clear Confederate victory in the West was the Battle of Chickamauga, after Rosecrans' successful Tullahoma campaign. Bragg, reinforced by Lieutenant General James Longstreet's corps, defeated Rosecrans despite the defensive stand of Major General George Henry Thomas. Rosecrans retreated to Chattanooga, Tennessee, where Bragg was then besieged in the Chattanooga campaign. Um, Grant marched to the relief of Rosecrans, where he led the defeat of Bragg's Third Battle of Chattanooga, eventually causing Longstreet to abandon his Knoxville campaign and driving Confederate forces out of Tennessee and opening a route to Atlanta in the heart of the Confederacy. Now, the Trans-Mississippi Theater refers to military operations west of the Mississippi, encompassing most of Missouri, Arkansas, most of Louisiana, and the Indian Territory and present-day Oklahoma. Um, the, um, the Trans-Mississippi District was formed by the Confederate States Army to better coordinate Ben McCulloch's command of troops in Arkansas and Louisiana, Sterling Price's Missouri State Guard, as well as the portion of Earl Van Dorn's command that included the Indian Territory and excluded the Army of the West. Um, now the Union's command was the Trans-Mississippi Division of the Military Division of West Mississippi. Now, Now, the first battle of the Trans-Mississippi Theater was the Battle of Wilson's Creek in August of 1861. The Confederates were driven from Missouri early in the war as the result of the Battle of Pea Ridge, And extensive guerrilla warfare characterized the Trans-Mississippi region as the Confederacy lacked the troops and logistics to support regular armies that could challenge Union control. Um, the roving Confederate bands, such as Quantrill's Raiders, terrorized the countryside, striking military installations and civilian settlements. Um, Now, the Sons of Liberty and Order of the American Knights attacked pro-Union people, elected office holders, and unarmed and the unarmed uniformed soldiers. These partisans could not be driven out of Missouri until an entire regular Union infantry division was engaged. Now, by 1864, these violent activities harmed the nationwide anti-war movement organizing against the re-election of Lincoln. Missouri not only stayed in the Union, but Lincoln took 70% of the vote to win re-election. Um, Now, small-scale military action south and west of Missouri sought to control Indian Territory and New Mexico Territory for the Union. The Battle of Glorita Pass was the decisive victory. Was the decisive battle of the New Mexico campaign. The Union repulsed Confederate incursions into New Mexico in 1862, and the exiled Arizona government withdrew into Texas. Now, in the Indian Territory, civil war broke out with tribes. About 12,000 Indian warriors fought for the Confederacy, but fewer for the Union. The most prominent Cherokee was Brigadier General Stan Whitey, the last Confederate general to surrender. And they start doing okay, after the fall of Vicksburg, in July of 1863, Jefferson Davis informed General Kirby Smith in Texas that he could expect no further help from the east of the Mississippi. Although he lacked resources to meet Union armies, he built up a formidable arsenal at Tyler, along with his own Kirby Smithdom economy, a virtual independent fiefdom in Texas, including railroad construction and international smuggling. The Union, in turn, did not directly engage him, but its 1864 Red River campaign to take Shreveport, Louisiana, failed, and Texas remained in Confederate hands throughout the war. Now, the lower seaboard theater refers to military and naval operations that occurred near the coastal areas of the Southwest as well as the southern parts of the Mississippi. Union naval activities were dictated by the Anaconda Plan. Now, one of the earliest battles that was fought in November of 1861 was at Port Royal Sound, which is south of Charleston. Much of the war along the South Carolina coast concentrated on capturing Charleston. And attempting to capture Charleston, the Union military tried two different approaches. They tried by land over James or Morris Islands, or throughout the harbor. However, the Confederates were able to drive back each attack. Now, a famous land attack was the Second Battle of Fort Wagner, in which the 54th Massachusetts Infantry took part. The Union suffered a serious defeat during this, losing 1,515 soldiers, while the Confederates lost only 174. Sorry, spacing out. Now, however, the 54th was hailed for its valor, which encouraged the general acceptance of the recruitment of African American soldiers into the Union Army, which reinforced the Union's numerical advantage. Now, Fort Pulaski on the Georgia coast was an early target for the Union Navy following the capture of Port Royal. An expedition was organized with engineer troops under the command of Captain Quincy Adams Gilmore, forcing a Confederate surrender. The Union Army occupied the fort for the rest of the war after repairing it. In April of 1862, a Union naval task force commanded by Commander David Dixon Porter attacked Forts Jackson and St. Philip, which guarded the river approach to New Orleans from the south. While part of the fleet bombarded the forts, other vessels forced a break in the obstructions in the river and enabled the rest of the fleet to steam upriver to the city. A Union Army force commanded by Major General Benjamin Butler landed near the forts and forced their surrender. Butler's controversial command of New Orleans earned him the nickname Beast. Now, the following year, the Union Army of the Gulf, commanded by Major General Nathaniel P. Banks, laid siege to Port Hudson for nearly 8 weeks, the longest siege in U.S. military history. The Confederates attempted to defend the Bayou Teche campaign, but surrendered after Vicksburg. Now, these surrenders gave the Union control over the Mississippi. Now, several small skirmishes, but no major battles, were fought in Florida, but the biggest was the Battle of Wallasey in early 1864. Now the Pacific Coast, refers to military operations on the Pacific Ocean and the states and territories west of the Continental Divide. Um, at the beginning of 1864, Lincoln made Grant commander of all Union armies, and Grant made his headquarters with the with the Army of the Potomac, and put Major General William Tecumseh Sherman in command of most of the western armies. Grant Grant understood the concept of total war and believed, along with Lincoln and Sherman, that only the utter defeat of Confederate forces and their economic base would end that war. Um, Now this was total war. Well, this was total war, not in killing civilians, but in injuring the Confederacy's capacity to produce and to transport the supplies needed to continue the war. Sherman, at Grant's direction, seized provisions and destroyed homes, farms, and railroads, which Grant said would otherwise have gone to support, would have gone to the support of secession and rebellion. But this policy, I believe, exercised a material influence in hastening the end. Um, now Grant devised a coordinated strategy that would strike at the entire Confederacy from multiple directions. Generals Meade and Benjamin Butler were ordered to move against Lee near Richmond. General Franz Sigel was to attack the Shenandoah Valley, but General Sherman was to capture Atlanta and march to the Atlantic Ocean. Generals George Crook and William Averill were to operate against railroad supply lines in West Virginia, and Major General Nathaniel P. Banks was to capture Mobile, Alabama. Um, Now, Grant's army set out on the overland campaign, intending to draw Lee into the defense of Richmond, where they would attempt to pin down and destroy the Confederate army. The Union army first attempted to maneuver past Lee and fought several battles, notably at the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, and Cold Harbor. Now, these resulted in heavy losses on both sides and forced Lee's Confederates to fall back repeatedly. Now, at the Battle of Yellow's Tavern, the Confederates lost Jem Stewart. Um, Now, an attempt to outflank Lee from the south failed under Butler, who was trapped inside the Bermuda Hundred River Bend. Each battle resulted in setbacks for the Union that mirrored those that they had suffered under prior generals. Though unlike them, Grant chose to fight on rather than to retreat. Um, Grant was tenacious and kept pressing Lee's army of Northern Virginia back to Richmond. While Lee was preparing for an attack on Richmond, Grant unexpectedly turned south to cross the James River, and they began the protracted siege of Petersburg, where the two armies engaged in trench warfare over the next 9 months. Um, Now, to deny the Confederacy continued use of the Shenandoah Valley as a base from which to launch invasions of Maryland and the Washington area, and to threaten Lee's supply lines for his forces, Ulysses S. Grant launched the Valley campaigns of the spring of 1864. Initial efforts led by General Sigel were repelled at the Battle of New Market by Confederate General John C. Breckinridge. The Battle of New Market was the Confederacy's last major victory, and included a charge by teenage VMA cadets. After relieving Sigel and following mixed performances by his successor, General Grant finally found a commander, General Philip Sheridan, aggressive enough to prevail against the army of Major General Jubal A. Early. After a cautious start, Sheridan defeated Early in a series of battles in September and October of 1864, including a decisive defeat at the Battle of Cedar Creek. Um, um, now, Robert E. Lee did not intend to surrender, but planned to regroup at a Potomac station, where supplies were to be waited and then continue the war. Now, Grant chased Lee and got in front of him, so that when Lee's army reached the village of the Potomac courthouse, they were surrendered. Were surrounded after the initial battle. Um, Lee decided that the fight was hopeless and surrendered his army of Northern Virginia to Grant on April 9th of 1865 during a conference at the McLean House. Um, Now, in an untraditional gesture and as a sign of Grant's respect and anticipation of peacefully restoring Confederate states to the Union, Lee was permitted to keep his sword and house traveler. His men were paroled and a chain of Confederate surrenders began. On April 14th of 1865, Lincoln was shot by John Wilkes Booth, a Confederate sympathizer. Lincoln died the next morning. Lincoln's Vice President Andrew Johnson was unharmed because his would-be assassin George lost his nerve, so Johnson was immediately sworn in as president. Now, the Union won the victory during the Civil War, and the Confederates lost. Now the causes of the war, reasons for its outcome, and even its name are subjects of the lingering contention. The North and West grew wealthy, while the once rich South became poor for a century. The national political power of the slave owners and rich Southerners ended. Historians are less sure about the results of post-war Reconstruction, especially regarding the second-class citizenship of the freedmen and their poverty. Now, historians have debated whether the Confederacy could have won the war. Um, Exact casualty figures were collected for the Union, but the Confederate records were poorly kept or lost in the chaos of the beat. Thus, the casualty figures are imprecise and based on statistical extrapolation. Neither side kept a tally of civilian deaths due to the war, but in the 19th century, the death toll had been estimated at about 620,000 people. In 2011, the death toll was recalculated based on a 1% sample of census data, yielded approximately 750,000 soldier deaths, 20% higher than traditionally estimated, and possibly as high as 850,000 people. Um, Now, after the Emancipation Proclamation authorized freed slaves to be received into the armed service of the United States, former slaves who escaped from plantations or were liberated by the Union Army were recruited into the United States Colored Troops regiments of the Union Army, as were black men who had not been slaves. The U.S. colored troops made up 10% of the Union death toll, 15% of the Union deaths from disease, and less than 3% of those killed in battle. Losses among African Americans were high, but in the last year and a half, and all from reported casualties, approximately 20% of all African Americans enrolled in the military died during the war. Um, the mortality rates were significantly higher than white soldiers, while 15% of the U.S. volunteers and just 9% of the white regular army troops died. 21% of the U.S. colored troops also died. Now, abolishing slavery was not a Union war goal from the outset, but it quickly became one. Lincoln's initial claims were that preserving in the Union was the central goal. In contrast, the South fought to preserve slavery, while not all Southerners saw themselves as fighting for slavery, but most officers and over a third of the rank and file in Lee's army had close family ties to slavery. So, to Northerners, the motivation was primarily to preserve the Union, but not to abolish slavery. However, as the war dragged on, it became clear slavery was central to the conflict, and that emancipation was, to quote the Emancipation Proclamation, a fit and necessary war measure for suppressing the rebellion. Lincoln and his cabinet made ending um, slavery a war goal, culminating in the Emancipation Proclamation. Now that Lincoln's decision to issue the proclamation angered peace Democrats, who were known as Copperheads and War Democrats, but they energized of the Republicans. But by warning that free blacks would flood the North, Democrats made gains in the 1862 elections, but they did not gain control of Congress. Um, Now, the Emancipation Proclamation legally freed the slaves freed the slaves in states in rebellion, but as a particular matter, slavery for the 3.5 million black people in the South effectively ended in each area when Union armies arrived. The last Confederate slaves were freed on June 19th of 1865 and celebrated as the modern day of Juneteenth, um, which some jobs recognize it as a holiday. Um, Slaves in the border states and those in some former Confederate territories occupied before the Emancipation Proclamation were freed by the state action on December 6th of 1865, which would become the 13th Amendment. Um, now this war devastated the South and posed serious questions on how it would be reintegrated into the Union. The war destroyed much of the South's wealth, in part because wealth held and enslaved held because in part because wealth held and enslaved people. At least 1,000 each for a healthy adult prior to the war was wiped off the books. Yeah, but I love history stuff. History is like one of my things. Um, Yeah, so that is about all for today. So next week I'm gonna do a the lost cause of the Confederacy, which is a continuation of the Civil War. If you like the video, you can get the video and like and subscribe to my channel, Rusty the King. Make sure to hit the notification bell, so that you can see more videos like this. Also, you guys can leave comments. Let me know what you guys think. Next week I will be this coming Saturday, which is I think August 30th. I'm gonna be doing a comedy segment. I'm gonna be doing stand-up comedy. Because that's just a thing to do when I'm bored. So I went to an open mic night yesterday, and I'm gonna have my friend record me and so I can upload my video to YouTube so you guys can see me doing comedy. That will be this Saturday. It starts at 4. So if you're ever in the Chicago area and you want to stop where Halsted and Armitage is, there's a place called there's a bar called the Store, and they have a little room for comedy, and you guys can watch me if you're ever in the area. Um, so there's that. But I am out of work for 6 weeks, so I can't do any physical work at my main job, UPS, because I hurt my shoulder. So right now I'm in physical therapy, which I got to go back to on Tuesday so they can try to work on the shoulder. Um, so we're gonna do that for right now. But I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I'll be back next week.